Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarne Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasati Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, so Mahaprabhu Kripa Prabhu is joining us in here he comes, Vot on. Very good. Very good. Okay. So let us begin. Let us begin our Nectar of Instruction session for this evening, going deeper into verse 2. And I'm going to chant pranams. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasati Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchikalpatarubhyas cha kripa sindhubhya evacha Patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. So welcome everyone. Welcome to our Nectar of Instruction seminar for this evening, April the 6th, 2020. Thank you very much for coming and participating. We appreciate your participation very much, and we hope it is helpful to you. Our discussion on Nectar of Instruction. So let us read the verse again. Let us read the verse again. Atyahara prayasascha Prajalpo niyamagraha Janasangas chilolyam cha Shadbir bhaktir vinashyati. One's devotional service is spoiled when he becomes too entangled in the following 6 activities. 1. Eating more than necessary or collecting more funds than required. 2. Over-endeavoring for mundane things that are very difficult to obtain. 3. Talking unnecessarily about mundane subject matters. 4. Practicing the scriptural rules and regulations only for the sake of following them and not for the sake of spiritual advancement, or rejecting the rules and regulations of Scripture and working independently or whimsically. Yes. 5. Associating with worldly-minded persons who are not interested in Krishna consciousness. And 6. Being greedy for mundane achievements. Yes. So it's very instructive, extremely instructive and valuable for us sadhakas, devotees, people who are trying to really become properly situated in Krishna consciousness and really develop a real attachment to Lord Krishna. So these are 6 things then which Srila Rupa Goswami is advising us so strongly they must be rejected or given up. It's very important. It's essential. Otherwise, one's attempt at devotional service will become spoiled. Yes. So let us now have a look through the purport at Srila Prabhupada's analysis of all these 6 particular undesirable activities. So now if you happen to have our PDF, if you do, actually I don't know how many of you do or don't, but if you do, let me tell you where you can find the place where we're at. Let's see, where are we now? Okay, we are on page 10 in our PDF. We're on page 10, and we are now pretty much where you could say about 12 lines from the bottom of the page, if that makes sense. There's just one full paragraph and then a couple of lines, and that's the end of this page. So hopefully you get the idea. So first of all, of course, there is Atyahara. Atyahara, eating more than necessary or collecting more funds than required, or for that matter, just collecting more of anything than is required. Funds, of course, are very prominent, but motor cars, how many motor cars can you drive at one time? Houses, how many houses can you live in at one time? Yeah. So like this, eating more than necessary or collecting more funds than required. So Srila Prabhupada in the purport, he gives a very specific example. At least first of all, first thing he does is give very specific example. Srila Prabhupada gives the example of if somehow or other a bag of grains falls off some vehicle onto the road, smash, and now there's grains all over or whatever, some foodstuffs on the ground. So Prabhupada makes the point that animals will come, of course. Animals will come. And the point he makes is they will eat some. They will eat some. They will take some. Then Prabhupada says, if a bag of rice somehow or other ends up in some public place open and accessible, then if a bird comes, the bird will take a few grains and then go away. This is how birds operate, and this is how the animals in so many cases operate also. So, but if a human being comes along, the human being will try to pick up the whole bag and take it home. Yes. So it's built into human nature to some degree, this propensity to collect more than what is really required. Even regarding money, Srila Prabhupada, his principle was generally that whatever we collect today, we spend tomorrow. That was generally Prabhupada's principle. Sometimes he did have long-term deposits, like 3 months or 6 months if there was some excess money, and some idea of using it after a little while. So Prabhupada did that sometimes. But otherwise, generally the principle was, what you collect today, you spend tomorrow. And we don't hoard and become like misers. This is not good for the character of the human being. Yes, so, and Prabhupada makes the point here, he makes an interesting point, right at the end of the purport. According to scriptures, this collecting of more than necessary, Atyahara, is prohibited. Prohibited. Now, the entire world is suffering because of it. Prabhupada doesn't mention specifically here, but definitely we're very clearly reminded of the Ishopanishad verse, the Ishavasya verse. Ishavasya Sarvamidam. What is it? Yat Kinchat. Anyway, Ishavasya, the Ishavasya principle. The Ishavasya principle that everything in creation is owned and controlled by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and by his arrangement, sufficient has been set aside for everyone so that everyone will have a quota. And quota means sufficient for everyone. And therefore we should live like this. This is the version of the Ishopanishad. Let me just, you know what I must do? I really must do. I actually must just, where is it? I don't know where it is. No, it's demanifested. I was going to actually read the whole verse properly, but where it's gone. Here it is, I found it. Let me just read that Ishavasya verse, because I think under the circumstances, it's really very important. It's mantra 1. It's mantra 1 of Ishopanishad. Let me just read it properly. Ishavasya midam sarvam yat kincha jagatyam jagat tena chaktena bunjita magradakashasviddanam. Everything animate or inanimate that is within the universe is controlled and owned by the Lord. One should therefore accept only those things necessary for himself, which are set aside as his quota. And one should not accept other things, knowing well to whom they belong. So this, what we read just now, reminds me very vividly, very clearly of this, that Prabhupada used the example of the bag of rice and the bird. But we can apply it in so many situations. The bag of rice, the bird comes, eats a few grains, goes. The human being comes, takes the whole bag, and off he goes with it. So how could he think that it's his quota, a whole sack of rice? No, it's just sort of dishonest, exploitative type of mentality. And as Prabhupada says, what did Prabhupada say? He said the whole world now the entire world is suffering because of this. And what he's referring to is how there are, relatively speaking, a small number of people in this world, definitely very small percentage, who are controlling and owning vast, vast quantities of wealth, which have absolutely got nothing to do with being anyone's quota, or their quota, or being money that they can actually utilize all of it constructively to benefit themselves and develop their lives. It's shocking, actually. It's absolutely, what would you say? Anyway, it's disgusting. It's really disgusting. So, and the part of the result of that is that in some parts of the world, people are really struggling. We hear that something like 35% of the world's population is living beneath the bread line, or the line of like proper survival. Somehow or other they're just hanging in there. But what do these super, super, super wealthy people do? They may do something, some charity, and so forth. Okay, that's nice. It's not bad. It's good if they do something. But the vast, vast majority of what they have somehow or other got their hands on, they just keep for themselves. And yeah, so it's sick. It's just extremely sick. Extremely sick. Okay, anyway. So yeah, so like this, the world is suffering. So many people are suffering because of this, totally unnecessarily. If the rich people gave away just 3/4 of what they have, what a massive difference it could make to the world. Anyway, and of course, I'm sure you've heard about how the American government, every year they dump, and the EU, they just dump into the ocean hundreds or maybe thousands of tons of different foodstuffs, butter and cheese and so on. Ah, Krishna, it's enough to drive a person mad, actually. My God. Okay, anyway, so Atyahara. And of course, mainly here Prabhupada was focusing, mainly he was focusing on collecting. But eating, well, we already read about that in the first verse. The tongue, belly, genitals, that whole idea. And we should eat to live and not live to eat. Everybody knows, at least the vast majority, they enjoy eating something which is nice to them. I mean, every devotee living knows that prasadam is very nice. But we should eat to live and not live to eat. Just like Prabhupada said regarding householders, I mean, it's not to do with food, but it's very relevant, that a householder, Krishna conscious householder, should work to live, but not live to work. You get the idea. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, so let's go on. Now, in our PDF, if you happen to be using it, we are right at the bottom of page 10, going over onto page 11. And here Srila Prabhupada is talking about Prayasa, over-endeavoring for mundane things, that are very difficult to obtain. Yes. So, of course, this is connected, and Prabhupada notes that, well, right at the beginning of this paragraph, getting into the subject of Prayasa, Srila Prabhupada notes that Prayasa, Atyahara causes Prayasa. Yeah. Or they're connected, not exactly causes, but they're just sort of inextricably connected. You want to collect a lot. You really want to collect a lot. So you got to work hard. You got to work very hard. That's over-endeavoring. Over-endeavoring. So this is very important point. So Srila Prabhupada, in the purport, Srila Prabhupada is encouraging simple living, plain thinking, and simple living and high thinking. Simple living, plain living, and high thinking. So there's no need. For example, like, particularly as we understand in America, but actually in many other places too, in order to go to work in the good job where they're earning a lot so they can get a lot, accumulate a lot, collect a lot, do a lot of Atyahara. In many cases, the people have to travel a long way. They don't just walk out the door and around the corner, something like that. But in many cases, they have to travel for 1 hour, 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours to work and then back. This is not uncommon, particularly in a place like America. It's not uncommon at all. What an endeavor. And so, if you drive for just, say, 2 hours, if you finish work at 5:30, and you get yourself together and you go out, and then you get into your car and you go out onto the road, and it's getting close to 6 o'clock, it may be 5:45, and now you've got to drive for 2 hours, it's 7:45. 7:45 by the time you get back. Devotees, many devotees, including me, when 9 o'clock comes, we start thinking about taking rest sooner rather than later. Yeah, so we can get up nice and early for Mangal Arti. Yeah, so this is over endeavor. Yes, so Prabhupada makes the point that right in the beginning of this paragraph, it's still back on page 10. Prabhupada makes the point that by God's arrangement, anyone in any part of the world can live very peacefully if he has some land and a milk cow. Sometimes Prabhupada talked about an acre, or something like that. Actually, an acre is a fair amount of land. But anyway, a certain amount of land and a cow, a person can live very peacefully. Agrarian society. But unfortunately, the people nowadays, they are not interested. They are really not interested at all. And so these types of arrangements, particularly in the Western world, where a person, a family, they just have their small farm and they're living. That whole type of arrangement has been replaced by industrialized agriculture. Yeah. Massive farms producing massive amounts of one crop to be sold for a profit. And what to speak of using fertilizers and all sorts of genetic modification and whatever. Well, welcome to Kali Yuga. So this is all over endeavor. It's all over endeavor. But rather one should try to live as simply as possible and have as much time and energy available as possible for cultivation of Krishna consciousness. Really. Sometimes I say to devotees that the best position for a householder who has a family, who has to provide, is find some sort of work or business arrangement where you do as little work as possible and get as much money as possible. Oh, you may laugh. Some of you may be sitting there right now laughing. Anyway, that's all right. But I know some devotees who do that. I know. Not so many, but I know some devotees who do that by using their intelligence, praying to the Lord, getting some mercy, thinking creatively. And then when you get some spare time, actually use it in Krishna consciousness. Don't sit and watch television and just waste your life and waste your brain. But do namahata, do bhakti vriksha, do book distribution, reach out to people, have a nice regular evening program with your family at home. Things like this. And that enriches so much spiritually. It enriches so much. Invite others. Have programs. This is what you can do if you've got some time and some energy from not having worked too much time and not having expended too much energy on working too hard. Yes. So anyway, Prabhupada makes the point in the purport. It's very, Prabhupada, he can put things in such interesting ways. Prabhupada says that if we advise people not to collect too much, eat too much, or work too much, many people will think we are asking them to become primitive again. Ah, yes, become primitive again. Ah, Krishna. So, yeah. Now, of course, an interesting point is that we should work hard for Krishna. And we should really try and do something in service to the Lord. But still, we should not over-endeavor even in Krishna consciousness. In the earlier parts of Nectar of Devotion, Srila Prabhupada discusses this, how a devotee shouldn't, unless, Prabhupada says, unless some rich supporters come along and just give sufficient money. It's best if devotees don't take on some big temple project which is just going to be just really like, who knows how they're going to get it done. It may be a noble idea, but it may be an over-endeavor, even in Krishna consciousness. Also, right around the same place in Nectar of Devotion, Srila Prabhupada makes the point that devotees, like preachers, should not study too many books. I mean, obviously, we have to study all of Prabhupada's books. Beyond that, well, if you don't go beyond that, that's fine. That's fine. But you don't want to become, in English we use the term bookworm. Have you heard that term? Bookworm. A person who's just submerged in books. Yeah. And just reading too much, particularly if there's some idea of trying to create the impression in people's minds that you're very knowledgeable and clever and all that sort of thing. So sometimes there can be, in Krishna consciousness, there can be over-endeavor. You know, that we have to see. We have to use our intelligence and maybe inquire from other senior devotees, our mentors, spiritual master. If there's some, big project potentially coming up, just really get some other perspectives on it before taking it up. Yeah. But particularly for the non-devotees, this whole thing of collecting too much on the basis of over-endeavor, it's really bad. So Srila Prabhupada, here we're on, what are we on? We're on page 11 in our PDF. And you'll see there right more or less in the middle of the page on the PDF, there is a Srimad Bhagavatam verse quoted. First canto, chapter 2, verse 9. Sutta Goswami describes the proper human dharma in this way. Dharmasya hyapavargasya narto tayolpakalpate. What? Narihasya, I think there's a spelling mistake. Narihasya dharmakantasya kamo labhaya hi smrita. You got it there?
Yeah.
Let me just see. What's the third line? Dharmaikantasya. What is it? Nartasya, not narihasya. The third line. Anyway, dharmasya hyapavargasya naratotayol pakalpate nartasya dharmaikantasya kamo labhaya hi smritaha. It's a very important verse right in the beginning of the Bhagavatam. Very important verse, famous verse. All occupational engagements, dharma, are certainly meant for ultimate liberation. They should never be used for material gain. Furthermore, one who is engaged in the ultimate occupational duty, occupational service, dharma, should never use material gain to cultivate sense gratification. I mean, that kind of sums it up, doesn't it? That's very nice. Although, it's interesting. Let's see, where are we now? Prabhupada, his discussion on this subject is actually pretty extensive. He discusses this verse quite extensively, even for the rest of the verse, of the page, you could say. Yeah, and even over onto the next page, That's really some extensive discussion from Srila Prabhupada. Other point he makes there, which is also, of course, extremely important. It's just really important. Prabhupada makes the point in the, we're on page 11, the last 2 paragraphs in our PDF. The first one starts, the first step in human civilization. If you're looking at a Russian version, you try and find that. Well, it's just after that Bhagavatam verse. So, yeah. And Prabhupada points out there that well, Prabhupada says the first step in human civilization consists of occupational engagements performed according to the scriptural injunctions for elevation, for ultimate liberation, as the verse said. But Prabhupada makes the point that we've got the Jewish people, the Muslim people, and the Buddhists, and we've got the Hindus, and we've got, whoever else. There are all sorts of different religious, denominations and divisions. But despite the presence of all of these things, all these different religions, which have, kind of very similar ideas in many ways, at least in principle, but generally, the people are using these religions, which according to that Bhagavatam verse, should be for ultimate liberation. But the people are using the religions for material advancement, for material gain, generally. Prabhupada, we've told the story many times, how Prabhupada, you can look it up in the folio on computer if you've got it, but Srila Prabhupada does a program quite early after arriving in America, not so long after arriving, in some sort of school of religion, seminary type of place. So he's giving a lecture to the students there. And at some point in the course of the class, Srila Prabhupada quotes the super famous little Christian sutra, "Give us this day our daily bread." I don't know if it's the most famous of all the Christian sutras, but it's right up there at the very least. Give us this day our daily bread. And Prabhupada says, so what is this? What is this prayer? Religion is meant to be for developing love for God. But what is this verse? Prabhupada says this verse is about love of bread. And that's generally how things go on in these different religions. There's a very major consciousness of, by the grace of God, improving our material situation. And it's corrupt, actually. It's corrupt. And just to bring out the point, just to really bring out the point, how's about we read Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 1, Verse 2, just to get the idea in this regard. Dharma projatakaitavotra paramo nimatsaranam satam, Vejavastavam atravastu shivadam tapatrayon mulanam, Srimad Bhagavate Mahamuni Krite Kim Vaparaya Ishvara Sadyorid Yavarujite Tra Kritibi Shushubrish Tat Tat Shanat. Translation. Completely rejecting all religious activities which are materially motivated, this Bhagavad Purana propounds the highest truth, which is understandable by those devotees who are completely pure in heart. The highest truth is reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all. Such truth uproots the threefold miseries, which we talked about yesterday. This beautiful Bhagavatam, compiled by the great sage Vyasadeva in his maturity, is sufficient in itself for God realization. Sufficient in itself for God realization. What is the need of any other scripture? As soon as one attentively and submissively hears the message of Bhagavatam, by this culture of knowledge, the Supreme Lord is established within the heart. Isn't this just, that is just so clear. So to the point. Whoa. It's sort of like a knockout blow, actually, to this whole idea of, even with respect in the Hindu community, the Tamil division, we just recently, here in South Africa, and I know in Malaysia also they do it, there was the Kavadi festival. And I won't go into all the details. Many of you know what Kavadi is. If you don't worry about it too much. But one of the main points is that you carry a certain device and walk for some distance. A whole lot of people walk and walk and walk some distance carrying this thing. And then they come back to the temple and now they've carried Kavadi. That's what they call it. Carrying Kavadi. And there's an idea that I will carry Kavadi in order to get XYZ. Very specific. Very specific. To carry Kavadi as an austerity for the pleasure of Muruga, in Tamil, Skanda, the demigod of war in Sanskrit. I will carry Kavadi for 3 years or whatever, so many times, in order to get. So this is a real corruption. It's a real corruption of what? Of Dharma, which the Bhagavatam verse says very clearly is certainly meant for ultimate liberation. What can you say? Okay, so what can we say? Next is Prajalpa. Let's have a look-see. Well, let me just briefly go through what Prabhupada says about Prajalpa. Prabhupada said a whole lot about Atyahara. Prayasa. Prabhupada said a whole lot about that, over-endeavoring for mundane things, and how the great interest in mundane things spills over into religion, which is actually meant for ultimate liberation, going back to Godhead. So he says a lot about that. It's actually more than one page. There's just one paragraph dedicated to Prajalpa. Prajalpa, of course, is very famous. Every devotee who's been around for a little while, they know what's Prajalpa. Yeah. So Prabhupada makes an interesting point. Prabhupada says, this often happens when we mix with a few friends. We begin unnecessary talk. Oh, how are you doing? And what are you doing? And did you hear this? And what do you think of that? And sometimes it's Krishna conscious, but sometimes it's not. Oh, Krishna. So, and Prabhupada uses an example he's already used. He uses an example he's already used. What was it? In speaking, Vachavegam. Vachavegam manasa krodhavegam. So Vachavegam, the urge to speak. Prabhupada talked about the frogs or the toads croaking and inviting the snake, advertising themselves to the snake. So Prabhupada actually gives the same example right here. He gives the same example that when we mix with a few friends, we immediately begin unnecessary talking, sounding just like croaking toads. Hari Bol. It happens to devotees. I mean, of course, devotees often talk about devotional service. Sometimes they actually talk about Krishna. What I just read in Bhagavad Gita or Srimad Bhagavatam. Sometimes they just have a talk like that. I want to give you a challenge. All of you out there, there's quite a few of you there. There's, what is it? It looks like now it's plus or minus 270 of you between Facebook Live and Instagram. I mean, there's probably more, actually. So there's quite a few of you out there. I want to give you a challenge that, let's say tomorrow at breakfast time or lunch time or both, if you're in a community situation, meaning you're not having your meal on your own, if you're with at least one other person, and maybe a group, but at least one other person, when you sit down to have your meal together, my challenge is, please start a Krishna conscious conversation. Please start a Krishna conscious conversation. It may take the others a little while to tune in, or maybe not, but if it takes the others a little while to tune in, just persevere, just keep going to get them involved. Yeah. And see what it's like. If you can have a nice Krishna conscious conversation over prasadam. That's a challenge for you. Okay, so we got to finish up here. Prabhupada's just very briefly talking about Prajalpa. Like we said, just one paragraph. And Prabhupada says, if we must talk, we should talk about the Krishna consciousness movement. Means, if we must talk with a few friends, like you said, speaking with a few friends, at least talk about the movement. At least the movement, what's going on in the movement, in constructive ways, or if possible, about Krishna directly. Yeah, why not? And Prabhupada says, nowadays people are very interested in reading heaps of newspapers, magazines, and novels, solving crossword puzzles. Let me just tell you a little story before we run out of time. We've practically run out of time. My mother, in her old age, I would go and visit her once a year for a few days. And she's this old lady, late 80s, 90. And what was her main engagement? Doing crossword puzzles. And I've got a reasonable vocabulary. I'm not exactly a star, but I've got a decent vocabulary. I was a journalist. So sometimes she would ask me, what's this word? And I would think and think, but then she'd get it. She would inevitably get it before me. It was interesting. In other words, she was expert when it came to words, crossword puzzles. But she just spent her time doing that. It was so unconstructive. Even I told her, why don't you at least enter some crossword competitions and win a prize? Win a prize. And that's something useful. You can use the money or whatever in some way or another to help yourself. But this way you're just spending time waiting to die. This is what's going on. And then Prabhupada, the last thing, pretty much the last thing, Prabhupada talks about old men in material society. They should be sannyasis, or at least vanaprasthas, and be actively, nicely engaged in spiritual cultivation and service and mentoring spiritually, advising after many years of experience like this. But Prabhupada says they retire from active life, play cards, fish, watch television, and debate about useless socio-political schemes. Again, this is classic Prabhupada. Just classic Prabhupada, just pointing out in a very cutting way what's wrong with some nonsense material situation. So Prabhupada then concludes the discussion on Prajalpa, at least for the time being. Intelligent persons interested in Krishna consciousness should never take part in such activities. Hare Krishna. So we will carry on, of course, tomorrow at 6, as usual. And, anyway, we'll just take it as it comes. Hopefully we'll finish, but if we don't, anyway, we'll just carry on until we do. Remember, if you've got questions, write them down in the little stream of comments and Hari Bols and Hare Krishnas and whatever that the devotees write. Sorry about that. Yeah. Write your questions down, and Premagni Devi Dasi on Facebook Live will collect your questions, or you can send them to her if you've got her email address or WhatsApp or whatever. On Instagram, Kirti Kumari Radhe, please send your questions to her, or just write them down in the stream and she will compile them. So for my part, thank you all very much. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Hare Krishna.